the director of the South Asia Institute at Columbia. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's colloquium with our speaker, Professor Nimanthi Rajasingham from Colgate University. Although she's not at the moment at Colgate, she's joining us in the middle of the night from Sri Lanka, where she happens to be right now. So even by today's Zoom standards, we're quite far flung, since I'm speaking to you from Paris, actually. So we're kind of all over the world. Professor Rajasingham is an associate professor of English and Women's Studies at Colgate. She completed her doctoral work at Rutgers University and her master's at JNU in New Delhi. Her 2019 book, Assembling Ethnicities in Neoliberal Times, Ethnographic Fictions and Sri Lanka's War, published by Northwestern University Press, drew on ethnographic modes and forms of inquiry to explore the role that colonialism, contemporary forms of globalization, and nationalism play in the production of ethnic identities and and ethnic violence. She did this by focusing on aesthetic production, including popular religious rural festivals, female workers' theater, novels on ethnic war, theaters of trauma and violence, and protest arts and literatures. Her earlier work includes the 2007 book, Feminist Engagements with Violence, Contingent Moments from Sri Lanka, which was co-authored with Lisa Kois and Rizvina De Alwis. And she's also done a 2008 volume, Constellations of Violence, Gender and Representation in South Asia, which was co-edited with Radhika Coomaraswamy, as well as she's also done several journal articles, which I won't take the time to mention, but mostly, I guess, connected with her work in Sri Lanka, although she's beginning to move into another area of expertise. Her current book project is at least tentatively titled, I am not your South Asian, Post-Apartheid Narratives in a Time of Terror, which involves research on South Asian diasporas in South Africa and the US, exploring strategies of refusing segregation and racial domination in both countries, especially after 2001. Nimanthi's talk today, Post-Apartheid Cartographies and the War on Terror, South Africa and England in the Writings of Ishtiyaq Shukri, will turn to the novel The Silent Minaret by this South African writer of Indian descent to discover ongoing forms of apartheid and surveillance capitalism after 9/11. Nimanthi will also explore how the novel turns to the Black consciousness movement to think through political Blackness as a useful strategy for contemporary politics. So I know you all join me in welcoming you to the South Asia Colloquium.
Great, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me pretty well? Yeah, okay. So thank you, Professor Ewing, for the invitation, and Bill Carrick for helping put this together. As you said, as I said, it's 1:30 in the morning here, and I'm caffeinated, but I may be a little slow. So this project begins, is the beginning work of my new turn to South Asian diasporas in the US and South Africa, right? And I look at authors, playwrights, and filmmakers and how they align themselves with the struggles of Black populations in their respective countries, right? As racist violence has increased. So this is new work, please bear with me. So I want to turn to two events, one recent and real, the other from South African writer Ishtiyaq Shukri's 2005 novel, The Silent Minaret. In a sense, I'm following a formal quality of the novel, which places together seemingly disconnected events to make us see new things. The first incident is about the violence that erupted in July 2021 in South Africa as ex-President Jacob Zuma was sentenced to serve prison time for not cooperating with the State Capture Commission in its investigation of corruption involving himself and the Indian-born Gupta brothers. While Zuma's followers had reportedly set off the massive violence, a number of newspapers covering the events also explained how the violence spread rapidly in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces because of massive poverty, exacerbated by extended COVID-19 lockdowns and recent stops to state grants. A South African scholar, Sithembile Mbete, explained, while unemployment rates are as high as 46% in South Africa, youth under 24 years of age are unemployed at 74%. People primarily store food and then refrigerators, TVs, and anything else they could get their hands on. Mbete therefore called the events of July 2021 food riots carried out by a hungry population. Predictably, the visuals you saw were of Black men looting and destroying private property, stories that easily conform to a narrative of Black crime. As surveillance strategies criminalizing Black South Africans geared up, they mobilized South Asians in Durban. Rumors of Black South Africans coming to destroy property and kill Indians spread on WhatsApp, Facebook, and other social media sites and inflamed the South Asian community at the Phoenix settlement. South Asians there armed themselves, set up barricades, patrolled the streets, and killed 33 Black South Africans who entered. Scene 2. In the Silent Minaret, Ishtiyaq Shukri tells us the story of Isa Shamsuddin, a young South African of South Asian descent, being profiled at Heathrow upon his return to London after a visit to Johannesburg. Isa had been living in London for a few years, writing his PhD thesis on the initial phase of European-African contact at the Cape. An anti-apartheid activist, Isa had begun research on the 17th century because he believed the immediate struggle to end apartheid had ended in 1994. Hence, this moment of interrogation and suspicion enrages him because Isa had not been targeted for being Muslim in South Africa. In fact, the novel makes clear that his identity as a Muslim was never at play until he is racialized as such after 9/11. As his mother Vasant explains, and I'm just going to quote, "Our family is of diverse faiths. Diversity is our normality. That's what we take for granted. It's what we nurtured. When the boys were growing up, home was always, still is, a secular place." If Vasant is culturally Hindu, Muhsin, Isa's estranged father, is a Muslim, if these are his kind of his parents' identities, then they do not shape him religiously. Forced into detention at the airport, searched and questioned over and over again, Isa explains in his journal that, I quote, "I feel violated, I feel sick, I want to puke." As he documents, he did not take the endless and meaningless interrogation quietly, but screamed at the officer, I quote, "Now let me out of this fucking place before I start reciting my thesis for you to write in that fucking little book of yours. You might find it interesting. Bits of it have to do with islands of interrogation, a little like this one." Feelings of fear, anger, humiliation, and anxiety continue after he leaves the airport. And in subsequent months, friends notice that Isa starts washing endlessly, anxious not to touch anyone or anything. And I quote, "He became more and more obsessive about avoiding contact." These two scenes of violence, one fictional but super ethnographic, what happened to Isa actually happened to the author Ishtiyaq Shukri himself. These two scenes of violence at first glance appear disconnected. Most explicitly in the first, Indians perpetrate violence while Isa is its victim. While one may be tempted to argue that the Phoenix anti-Black violence is due to the lingering effects of apartheid segregation, which created suspicion among segregated communities of one another, Isa's treatment seems to be clearly about Islamophobia, right? In both instances, however, surveillance capitalism hovers over the scene. In 2021, social media apps repeated videos of Black crime through its algorithms of hate and combined with old prejudice to produce deadly results. We need to only remind ourselves of what Facebook whistleblower Frances Hogan said about how Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp cluster information of a similar nature to like-minded groups to increase panic, hate, and anxiety. And I think I remember her, she said, hate pays. So that circulates more, right? So let me just share, I have some slides and I wanna share the first one. And this is from Shoshana Zuboff in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, explains how surveillance capitalism unilaterally claims human experience as free raw material for translation into behavioral data as a proprietary behavioral surplus fed into advanced manufacturing processes known as machine intelligence and fabricated into prediction products that anticipate what you will do now, sooner, and later. Such information and patterns have been sold to corporations for profit. As she explains, while these surveillance systems were initiated by Google, etc., before the war on terror, after it, surveillance capitalism enabled the state to use people's likes, dislikes, calls, and clicks as raw material to predict patterns of terrorist behavior. In the US, the Patriot Act; in England, implementing and strengthening existing terrorism acts, and eventually the Prevent strategy led to increased violations of human rights, the human rights of individuals in the name of security. In his second novel, published in 2014, titled ICU, Shukri details even more clearly how the surveillance state has robbed South Africans of their freedom. The Silent Minaret delves into how technologies singled out Arab Muslim men as dangerous, especially if they were critical of empire, as Isa is. Now, the exercise I just carried out, right, of placing these seemingly two different things next to one another is a key feature of the Silent Minaret to expose a crucial fact. This is what I want to argue, that we are not living in the post-apartheid era. Segregation persists, and not as a legacy from an older system we are slowly leaving behind, but as a structure that repurposes older patterns of fixing and classifying populations to produce new spaces of enclosure. The novel brings us to sharp focus through its form. The Silent Minaret is about, maybe I'll stop the share for a minute and then I'll go back. The Silent Minaret is about the search for a disappeared protagonist, as he did in South Africa against an apartheid state. Isa participates in anti-racist protests after 9/11 in London. According to his neighbor Francis, soon after he ran over to protest the massive police raid of the Finsbury Mosque in January 2003, Issa disappears or is disappeared. And this 2003 raid on the mosque is actually a historical event, right? That Shukri fictionalizes. As she remembers, more than 100, and I quote, more than 100, 150 of them from up here, I had no idea all that was taking place down there. And for what? A toy gun and a couple of gas canisters, more enemies made than caught, if you ask me. Several men were arrested, all foreigners, end of quote. Francis worries that Issa may have been picked up. The novel's present is largely about his family and friends' search for Issa as they attempt to understand why and how he disappeared. So while a number of scholars like Pallavi Rastogi, Deborota Kucherova, and critical essays have commented on the novel's hybrid form, indexing England and South Africa as multiracial spaces that celebrate multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. I want to focus instead on how the formal experiments counter the classificatory registers of surveillance capitalism, right? If surveillance capitalism creates algorithms and patterns out of people's beliefs, desires, and needs for profit making, the novel's form does the opposite. It critically demonstrates how surveillance shows up segregation, and it does so through fugitive archives, those born out of fragmented memories of Issa's friends and family recounted non-linearly through redacted documents, passages from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, from the Quran, and Issa's thoughts, journal entries, and parts of his doctoral thesis, right? If in doing so, the novel asks us to rethink the end of apartheid's story, we are offered a number of examples that juxtapose different events, spaces, and times so we can contemplate the nature of contemporary forms of segregation. For surveillance capitalism builds off methods used historically by apartheid states and repurposes them. While the novel may indeed celebrate multiculturalism, I want to argue that the novel focuses on the urgent need to revive anti-colonial struggles through collective resistance. This is done through the text's allusions to political blackness, the Black consciousness movement, and Steve Biko. And I'm going to turn to that in the second part of the presentation. Through a queer and feminist rewriting of the Black consciousness movement, the novel invites us to think along similar lines of political affiliation for our present post 9/11 moment. Okay, so section 1, post-apartheid cartographies. A standard definition of apartheid can be found in the 1973 UN-adopted International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, right? And the definition is that apartheid consists of policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination, right? But authors like Julian Cooney in his book, Is Apartheid Really Dead? And Andy Klarner more recently in his book, Neoliberal Apartheid, modify this definition of kind of racial domination to insist on apartheid's grounding in racial capitalism. As they both demonstrate, despite formal equality before the law, voting rights, etc., economic inequality can persist and strengthen new forms of segregation in South Africa. In terms of our novel, we can dig into what Issa said at Heathrow about islands of interrogation to think through racial capitalism and segregation, right? During a period of surveillance capitalism. So what are these islands of interrogation? One day while working in his favorite cafe in London, right? Baghdad Cafe, super Orientalist name. Issa sees blurred pictures on this giant screen of so that pictures, this is a quote, blurred pictures on the giant screen of heavily shackled men in orange overalls behind high security fences, right? Their arms chained behind their backs to their feet, a notice on the fence, honor bound to defend freedom. This scene is from the Guantanamo prison with its absurd claims to defending freedom through torture and incarceration. Now, when Isa sees this on the screen, it triggers for him a really different moment, right? And he says, in 1694, Aberdeen Tadia Yusuf, a member of the Maka Saresi royal family and the nephew of King Bisay of Goa, arrived at the Cape Colony, shackled in chains that belonged to what was then the world's largest trading company, right? The Dutch East India Company. Merchant capitalism and these islands of interrogation are then connected. Aberdeen Tadia Yusuf, popularly known as Sheikh Yusuf, and the father of Islam in South Africa, was brought to the Cape because he resisted Dutch Empire, right? The novel continues to tell us that the Dutch East India Company was a global corporation that functioned as a state outside of a state, with a focus on, the attainment of economic profit and the power to pursue it unchecked. Slaves were brought in from Mozambique and Madagascar, but most were shipped to Table Bay from Dutch colonial territory in their Eastern Empire, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Ceylon. The majority were Muslim, who at the Cape became known collectively as Cape Malay. In these notes, right, these are bits from actually Shukri, Isa's doctoral work, right? In these notes connecting incarceration, enslavement, and profit-making, Isa also alludes to how the figure of the slave or the Cape Malay in the 17th century was produced out of people from a number of countries, similar to how the terrorist as a singular figure is produced out of the multitude through contemporary surveillance systems. Both systems of classification fix people to separate them from other groups for domination and exploitation. As Nilika Jayawardena says in Forgetting Maps, and I quote, through juxtaposing the two histories, Shukri leads his readers to draw the similarities. If bodies were moved, removed, and erased in the path of the spice trade during the 17th and 18th centuries, bodies are also disappeared as collateral damage in the struggle to control the production and distribution of today's worth its weight in gold commodity, petroleum, right? And I would add to this that the very process of surveillance and disappearance or incarceration, the technology necessary for that in itself is a key profit-making kind of method, right? And that's kind of Shoshana Zuboff's point, that the very technology used is kind of racial capitalism, right? So to return to the text, right? The inclusion of South Asians as part of 17th century settlements in the Cape claims a history for them in South Africa well before their arrival in Durban during the late 18th century. The turn to Indian Ocean slavery as the origins of South Asians in South Africa, and the fact that Sheikh Yusuf established the first Muslim community in South Africa attracted, and this is a quote again, attracted runaway slaves who converted to Islam and represented a symbol of resistance to European colonialism. So this kind of claim, right, this rewriting or this remembering, right, writes Islam not as fundamentalist, but as anti-colonial. Hence, by placing two seemingly different examples together, we can reflect on how Black sites have a historical place in the development of racial capitalism. A second comparative moment reflects on apartheid era terror in South Africa as it relates to the war on terror. I return to the 2003 police raid of the Finsbury Mosque in London. When we read about the moment, Isa's thoughts are triggered to remember another event. Similarly, right? He connects it to another event, which is a South African Special Forces attack on anti-apartheid protesters in the Cape in the late 1980s. The scene that transitions the reader from London to Cape Town is so seamless that it takes multiple readings to track the shifts in time and place, right? So this is what Isa remembers when he's at the mosque. He says, Hollywood, Vietnam descends into view from the Union Building. A blind spot, disorienting approach from behind. Police hang out of helicopters, balancing on the landing rail, but not to lift them all to safety. Guns at the ready, aimed at the crowd. Most fall on the ground in fear, covering their heads with flailing arms. Indeed, these lines could belong to either scene, right? They fit both. Once we realize we have been moved from London to South Africa, we have to reflect on the politics of the raids in London, right? We are asked to question who is designated a terrorist in the war on terror if students protesting apartheid were once similarly shot at in South Africa. The extraordinary power of the police, fully armed, targeting unarmed civilians from above, illustrates just how vulnerable and powerless the protesters felt as they hit the ground, hoping they would not be shot at. Isa, attempting to escape, grabs a young woman protester next to him and runs into one of the university buildings. As the novel exclaims, and I quote, "They slam through the glass doors and into history," meaning into literally the building that houses the history department, right? At the University of Western Cape, where Isa was a student, but also against the historical imperatives of an apartheid state that has declared a state of emergency so as to arrest and disappear activists with impunity. The applicability of this scene to London in 2003 implies a certain history is repeating itself, and that Isa's protest against the mosque raid is a continuation of his struggles against apartheid. Overall, the formal placement of both scenes together demands a rupture to a historical telling that labels one set of events as concluded and belonging to the past, right? And there's this reference Isa uses during this time, and it's from T.E. Lawrence, right? And he quotes it in the book. He says, I think this captures kind of his feelings about apartheid not ending, right? And he says, and this is a bottom quote, "Yet when we achieved and the new world dawned, the old men came out again and took our victory to remake it in the likeness of the former world they knew." While these scenes invite us to reflect on how sites such as mosques may become spaces of segregation or separation, they also illuminate the differences between old and new forms of racial domination. In the scene setting in South Africa in the late 1980s, students were protesting a state that was in crisis as it held on to apartheid. By contrast, the surveillance system in place at Finsbury does not define itself as trying to uphold the separate development of races or ethnic groups, but argues that, that citizen safety is priority. The mosque seems integrated into a multicultural city, but is made exceptional or separate at certain moments, and through surreptitious spying. The massive expansion of military and police budget to surveil and watch populations tell us about the costs of war and the cost of anti-terrorism, right? So section 2, a queer feminist rewriting of the Black consciousness movement, right? The War on Terror produces Muslim and Arab others, reworking the longer histories of Orientalism for new imperial purposes. By moving back and forth between race politics in South Africa and England, the novel discusses how Isa became politically Muslim in London, but also how he became politically Black in South Africa. Written decades after the murder of Stephen Biko, the leader of this Black consciousness movement, the novel presents its thinking through a carefully crafted feminist queer focus. Again, the novel highlights how forms of surveillance were used to separate and dominate people for profit, right? So this is kind of the epitaph to Steve Biko that's in the novel, right? And kind of its place significantly, right? And so for those of you who don't know, Biko was incarcerated, tortured, deprived of medical care and left to die, right, in the 1970s. Subsequently, his murder was labeled as brain injuries sustained in a scuffle with the police. And despite the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's finding that Biko's murder was a gross human rights violation, no one was punished because of the amnesty clause within the commission's proceedings. At one level, the scenes call into question the premise that apartheid actually ended in 1994, because perpetrators of such heinous crimes escape punishment. More importantly, the novel invites us to reflect on Biko's legacy and the ongoing importance of the movement, right? Now, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Black consciousness movement. I'm not sure if many of us know about it, so I'll just very briefly mention it, okay? It was a movement that emerged in the 1960s when many members of the Pan-African Convention and the African National Congress had been arrested, murdered, and driven out of the country. The Black Consciousness Movement, or BCM, filled a vacuum when other movements had to go underground, right? It transformed the consciousness of South Africans, inviting them to take pride in being Black. And its members were central to organizing the Soweto uprisings in 1976. Biko and other members wrote a great deal about what it was to be Black and rewrote Blackness as political identity that should be nurtured and mobilized to create unity among differently oppressed and exploited groups. As Biko says in his book, I write what I like, right? It's a collection of his writings that were put together after his death. He says that Black is not biological, but this is a quote, those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, and socially discriminated as a group in South African society and identifying themselves as a unit in the struggle towards the realization of their aspirations, right? This is his definition of Blackness. So the first is that you're externally classified negatively, right? Where you don't have power of self-definition. But the second part of that sentence is that you kind of transform that into a label of pride, but also of collectivity and struggle, right? To struggle against apartheid, one has to be a unit, a collective. It is struggle and a transformed consciousness that makes you Black. If not, as BCM writers explained, you are simply a non-white person. You couldn't claim the label of Blackness, right? As Biko says, and that's the second quote, being Black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being Black is a reflection of a mental attitude, a coming into consciousness through a process of decolonization, right? And so at the time, the apartheid state was creating Bantustans or homelands, right? And separating people, evicting them, from citizenship in South Africa, and appointing kind of group leaders who were supportive of the South African apartheid state. So the BCM like rejected Bantustans and thought all these different groups should be a collective under the sign of Blackness, right? So as people like Ashwin Desai have written, right, about South Asians and Indians and their participation in the Black consciousness movement, Desai says, in proposing the identity of Black to unite all whom apartheid oppressed, the BCM activists tried to break out of apartheid identities and congeal them into new identities, a lived identity that involved a kind of disassembled and reassembled unity, right? And activists like Fatima Mir, Sats Cooper, Monty Naika were really involved in the Black consciousness movement. Now, such an understanding of being politically Black is explored in the novel through a turn to Issa's two mothers and brothers. In doing so, the novel takes into account what Kumla Dineo Bukola argues was a blind spot in the BCN, right? That it was not critical of Black, like of patriarchy, and it was blind to gender inequality, right? Issa's biological mother is Vasant Kumar, a woman of Indian descent who is a doctor. His other mother is Gloria from Tong, a small village, right? Who comes to live with Vasant and Issa with her own son, Kagiso. Their co-mingling occurs under desperate conditions for both women. Their shared lives, especially navigating the domestic sphere, teaches Issa what a politically Black identity is, right? So this is when Kagiso remembers, right, from piece together conversations between his mothers, how Vasant and Gloria came together, right? And he says, right, or he sees, and these are his thoughts. This is Issa's kind of brother, right? He sees Ma Gloria walking down the road. He himself is 2 months old. The bundle strapped in a blanket to her back. He sees her eventually walking down Ma Vasant's driveway. Ma Gloria puts her face towards the kitchen window. The woman falls to the floor. The man looks up and sees the witness in the kitchen window. He turns away and runs. Kagiso, as I said, can't remember this scene, but it's pieced together, right? There's no courtship and queer coming out. And actually in the novel, we are never told if these women are sexually intimate. Rather, the story is of the family begins with fugitivity and escape from apartheid surveillance. For Gloria is a new mother without a passport. She's in search of a place to work safely. The apartheid state dictates when and how she can work. While Sant is an abused woman who is beaten by her husband Musin, who abandons her that very day. While Gloria may be more structurally vulnerable, she comes to be the actor in this scene. Vasant goes into labor as a result of Musin's kick, and Gloria delivers the baby on the kitchen floor. Her midwifery saves Vasant and Issa. Musin and subordinate patriarchy are not forgiven nor excused, and women's gendered labor is prioritized, right? The two women meant by the apartheid state to live separately decide to cross boundaries and form a family unit. Their sacrifices and mutual dependencies are discussed at length, right? And to protect Gloria and Kagiso from being taken by the Black Jacks or the municipal police, who raided homes looking for Black South Africans without passes, the two mothers pretend that the kids and Gloria are playing hide and seek. And this is a quote: the game would start with a knock on the door. Ma Vasant would look at Gloria, who would rush the boys into hiding. They hid behind Ma Vasant's secret bathroom, behind the built-in wardrobes in her bedroom, behind the geyser in the roof, in the neighbor's kitchen. Ma Gloria had thrown them over the back wall before jumping herself and spraining her ankle. The domestic sphere, bathroom, bedroom, geyser, kitchen, back wall, are essential for the survival of the family and to escape surveillance. Because the two children hide and escape together, first thinking it's a game, later realizing what was actually going on, they learn in their homes how to resist. Because Khagisa and Isa both hid to hide with their Black mother, while the other uses her privileged status to protect all of them, they see themselves as integrally entangled in one another's lives. This is such a far cry from the incident in Phoenix that I began this essay with, or for example, Gandhi's own attitudes towards Black South Africans, right? Protecting one another is a form of queerness, a practice, a way of life. It is a way of refusing surveillance, and is a way that, Isa learns to be Black, right, politically. So to return to London then, when Isa learns that he is a Muslim after 9/11, it is not because he is religious, but because he is labeled as such by the state and by terrorist kind of surveillance, right? But surveillance against so-called terrorism. By protesting the mosque attack, he aligns himself as politically Muslim or Arab. I want to argue that his upbringing at home and his activism in South African struggles offer Isa a way of thinking collective identity, right? And this is my final and short section. It's called We Are All Arabs Now. Late one night, sitting in Baghdad Cafe, maybe I'll just exit for a moment. In Baghdad Cafe, Isa urgently texts his South African friend Katinka, asking her to come over. As he urges her to drive over in the middle of the night, he texts, and I quote, "Kids are dying here. Get your gat over here ASAP and fuck lemonade. We're all Afghan Arabs now." What Isa means by this is not explained, except that he sends Katinka this text on the night that the US and England invade Afghanistan. When Katinka arrives at the cafe, everyone there is glued to the screen, watching an invasion, and I quote, projected live onto a screen the size of a fucking Piccadilly Circus billboard. Katinka recalls later. This is the last time Katinka sees Isa. Later one day, after Isa had disappeared, Katinka too repeats, "We are all Arabs now," at the same cafe. Now, generally speaking, we all know this, Afghan people are not considered to be part of the Arab-speaking world. So when Isa uses this term, Afghan Arab, it does not mean it as a literal interpretation of identities, right? When Isa uses the term "we're all Afghan Arabs," he uses it to include himself in a collectivity of the oppressed to reclaim a stereotype, right? As discussed earlier, if Black consciousness is about loving an identity that has been negated by those who wield colonial power, then claiming to be Arab functions similarly. Isa claims the identity in solidarity. If Isa uses this term as a political claim, then we must ask how and why the novel gives these words to Katinka, his Afrikaner friend, and ends the novel with her, right? Her use of the term is unexpected. When I first read it, I thought, oh, this is this, white woman appropriating, an oppressed identity, right? That's what it reads like when she says it. And yet, a feminist interpretation of Katinka's actions may lead us somewhere else. So I'm going to test it out and you can disagree with me. For the novel concludes by turning to another iteration of apartheid, perhaps one of its most brutal forms in our contemporary present. Katinka's choices model another possibility of being politically Arab through a refusal of whiteness and through a denial of safety and privilege, right? So Katinka's first encounter with Isa and Kagisa is when so it tells us how she kind of refuses whiteness, right? She meets Isa and Kagisa on the road, hitching a ride as she flees her family to rejoice in Mandela's release from prison. Despite her father's warning, and I quote, "If you go, you are not welcome in my house anymore. You're not my daughter anymore. How do you expect me to face them with a daughter who runs after a communist terrorist," and the K word, which I won't say. Her brother threatens to shoot her if he sees her again. Though initially suspicious of her, at the celebration, Isa, I quote, looks across the room to where Katinka has blended effortlessly into the celebrations. And as he watched her dance, rejoice, hands high in the air, it came to him. The system imprisoned us all. The moment of her merging into the multitude, where boundaries that had segregated communities and people from one another melted into air, is utopian in the novel. It is a flash, a moment when anything seemed possible, right? This is when Mandela is released and you're like, apartheid is over, the world is about to change. And I remember that moment myself as a young adult, watching it and feeling certain, right? Mandela is like the Messiah. And the gathering to celebrate him, I quote, release, the catharsis, the ecstatic jubilation here in the city, across the country and the world. The moment of connection, of emotion and joy merges her with others, right? This is who she is. Now, Katinka's choices point us to another example of how to be politically Arab, as she chooses to give up the privileges of being politically white and leaves London for the West Bank, right? For while she also moves to London when Isa does, and while they're friends, in London, she meets Karim, a Palestinian man who she falls in love with and remains attached to even after he returns home to Qalqilia in the West Bank, a city strangled by Israel's border wall. And I'm just going to quote from the novel, right? And this is what Karim says about the wall. He says, it is 8 meters high. We never see the sun. Our house is always in its shadow. When I look through my bedroom windows, this is all I can see, the wall. It does what it is designed to do, make us feel small. So here we are again, in the most terrifying space of apartheid. People separated, starved of economic activity, even cut off from the sun. As Shukri, upon visiting Palestine, tells us, Israeli occupation of Palestinians is kind of worse than South African apartheid, right? The surveillance system is in place, military monitoring of Palestinians from every angle, technological surveillance that has led to numerous bombings, the surveilling of Palestinian land and evictions, and within the West, right, the complete surveillance of any criticism of Israeli apartheid, right, leaves no doubt that apartheid is not behind us, but a present and future reality. Katinka, right, repeats the common, skip this. Okay, Katinka repeats the commonplace claim of what the occupation has done to Palestinians and the world's ability to access Palestine. And she says, right, I quote, she will have spent 5 hours flying from London to Tel Aviv and a disproportionate 18 hours traveling the short distance from Tel Aviv to Qalqilia, to Karim behind the wall. Like Isa, we never encounter Karim. He too is an absent presence, but whose life under occupation and apartheid is certain and spelled out in the novel. He does not know how to find Isa, but she does not know how to find Isa, but to find Karim, Katinka must disappear behind the wall herself. In a sense, she must decolonize her life and give up the privileges of being white. She also did this in some way when she fled her family farm, and she does it again, right? She placed herself within a space of vulnerability to share with him, his family and other Palestinians, a life that most would flee. It is not surprising then that the novel ends with her. The last lines of the novel are this, right? The last page of the novel has this. It's a text she sends to Isa's phone. He's missing, but she sends it, right? Hoping he gets it. She says, I'm by the wall at Kalkiria. When Jan landed at Cape, he planted a hedge to separate the settlers from locals. The history of early European settlement and the Cape is universally and eternally pertinent, right? What began at the Cape with the first settlement of Jan van Riebeeck is relevant for us today in London and in Palestine. The wall in Palestine, we know and see this apartheid is documented. The other forms, ongoing apartheid in South Africa, surveillance capitalism in London, may create invisible walls. As I have tried to show in this paper, apartheid has never been something we have moved on from. It has changed its contours, but is always there. Thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Very, very nicely crafted, very interesting. Maybe I'll just begin by asking others if they have questions, comments, reactions. Or sort of get that out there so that you're thinking about how to respond. And maybe I'll start. And I should say this is pretty far from my own expertise. So my questions I think are going to be perhaps somewhat naive or generalizing, but I'm curious. At some level, I'm sorry to turn away from I think the really powerful point that you make at the end of the paper, but I'm curious about sort of the broader trajectory of your work and I know that in your earlier work on Sri Lanka, you used, I think, a variety of methods, as I suggested in my introduction. And I'm just wondering, in this project, where, of course, in this paper, you've focused very much on interpreting a novel. And I'm just wondering if what carries over from your earlier work, or whether you've really kind of turned a corner and changed direction somewhat in your approach itself.
Oh, for my kind of my first book on Sri Lanka, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I think for me, kind of, in that work too, I look at kind of diasporic formations, right? I look at this Tamil writer, Shobha Shakti, who lives in Paris and writes, this book called Gorilla and acts in this film called Deepan. So I'm very invested in kind of the diasporic space and how it interacts with the nation state in that work. But I'm also formally interested in writers who are extremely experimental, their work, and Shobha Shakti really is, right? So Shukri's kind of intense, experimental, putting things together that don't merge together, indexing different literary traditions, right, to make these arguments, is something that I focus on throughout. And, this is in my book, when I say assembling ethnicities in neoliberal times, I'm also looking at the assemblage of aesthetic forms, right, as kind of this merging and coming together of different formations. And I do that in my own chapters, kind of bringing together an assemblage. So I think that's why maybe Shukri's work was so attractive to me, because he is assembling bits from here to tell this story, a through line, right? And if you read his second novel, I See You, it's even more kind of assembled kind of, material, archival material, interviews, clips from documents, fiction, they kind of merge, right? And it's trying to make sense and tell a story. And I guess that form of kind of innovation really interests me, because I'm always asking, why this kind of, why not the conventional novel? Why this indexing? Why this bringing together? If that makes sense. So that's something that I kind of carry over to my own kind of interest in scholarship.
I see. That's interesting. Now, we have comments. Perhaps MP has made some comments in the chat. Would you like to appear and speak directly? And if not, perhaps it would make sense for me to read it out, since otherwise it just kind of goes by. Let's see if I can.
I'm happy to kind of, if you want to read it out or ask it, or I'm happy to respond. If
you want to read it out, or what was the second option?
I can just respond to the question, since everyone can see it, I guess.
Oh, okay. But you have to read it first.
Okay. I don't know if MT wants to say it, or.
Okay. Okay, well, why don't I read? Well, okay. Maybe I read it just so you get a chance to listen and think, rather than have to also read. Many new productive areas of research here in this presentation. So I very much agree with that. That's my aside. But it does repeat much of the writing and specific language phrases in earlier papers. But several sections cover ground covered in Jayawardana's Forget Maps, documenting global apartheid and creating novel cartographies, in Ishtiyaq Shukri's The Silent Minaret in particular. Some of the same terms and phrases are used, and this can be avoided by crediting the scholar or taking care not to cover the same ground.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So I do credit, I think I quote from the article at a specific point. And I do find that essay very productive. And, when this is hopefully written up and published, obviously I'll be more kind of, footnotey than a presentation allows. But I would say this, that I think I would depart a little bit, or my argument shifts a little bit, some of the debates, by thinking really what Shoshana Zuboff says in Surveillance Capitalism, about surveillance capitalism, that it's not a method used to get petroleum, as in the 17th century surveillance was used for the spice trade. I think what Zuboff points to is that the surveillance itself is the end game, right? That is a profit-making activity, and that that we as humans ourselves are like the raw material, right? That's kind of her argument. And our intense investment in social media, in apps, in front of our screens kind of feeds into that. And so I really kind of try to think about that a little bit, and think specifically about racial capitalism. And I guess that's why I begin with the Phoenix settlement and that incident, because it tells me very clearly that here are old prejudices for sure, right? Out of a long history of apartheid, which placed Indians and Black South Africans as antagonistic and separated them. But then there's this surveillance capitalism that kind of feeds into that loop, right? And kind of repurposes it. And social media exacerbates, amplifies, reproduces all of that, right? And so I try to think about the way surveillance capitalism works and the way it functions as a force for racial capitalism, right? So Muslims as terrorists becomes a way for surveillance technology to become super important and therefore generate enormous profits. So I hope I kind of, maybe I muddled in kind of saying that because I was covering so much ground. but that's where I would say, like, I'm trying to shift her, Nilika's, Jawaharlal's debates forward a little bit. And I hope that helps.
Thanks. Yeah, MP also notes the research connecting to new violence in South Africa towards Indians is really interesting. And as is the reference to the ways Black consciousness is referenced, used, responded to, and woven through. So, well, thank you, MP, for that. Do we have other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Yes, I had a question. Wonderful to see this this talk in action, Nimanthi. Very, a lot of food for thought. And I just had I guess a small question about the notion of disappearance as resistance, right? So the idea that Isa is never found. And I was just wondering if you had further thoughts about that as a form of resistance, right? I mean, obviously the idea of surveillance being a form of domination, and so disappearing from, being off the grid as a form of resistance to that formation. And then if you can think along with me with your first book, which talks about ethnographic fiction, and how that is really premised on this notion of not surveillance exactly, but of taxonomies and classification. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more towards those moments or those gestures of resistance a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think a number of scholars have commented on this, so this is not like new to me, but they've argued that, I can't remember the authors right now of the articles, but there's been significant commentary on how Isa's disappearance at one level could be that he was taken to a Black site, for example. But the other argument could be that he kind of ejects himself from the system, right? That is constantly surveilling him. And maybe this is his way out. And is that a possibility, right? And I guess I would add to that, I mean, it's really unsaid, but I would add to that what the novel definitely asks us to participate in is this journey of grief and loss, right? And if that in itself is a form of resistance, maybe that's useful, which is that his family, the novel is full of thoughts of his family and friends grieving him. There's scenes of, Mava Synth coming to London to look for him. She's really distraught. There's feelings of Kagiso, his brother, coming 4 months later to close up his apartment because it's been 4 months and he's never going to return. And so there's the novel kind of asks us to really get to know Isa through these other characters and grieve him, and then in a way sit with the fact that we won't know, right? And I think it's saying, what happens to people whose families are taken to Black sites? What happens when you never find out, or you don't know for years, or so that, if you can call that resistance, Tavi, maybe there is some form of, critical engagement and resistance in that very kind of collective memory kind of form of the novel, right? Yeah, and I guess absolutely. And again, this is something that Jayavarden's essay also touches on, which is, and she talks about, the ways in which classification was central to apartheid, and isn't classification central to the war on terror. And I would add, doesn't surveillance capitalism constantly classify and fix people, separate them, right? As I was talking about, and produce new racial groups again and again, right? It's made and remade. Ethnicities and races are made and remade. And in my first book, when I talk about ethnographic fictions, I'm talking about fictions that have internalized that classificatory impulse, right? And also then decolonial fictions too. So yeah, I think the novel shows you that, but I would say the novel is invested in trying to resist that, right? That's why Isa is told through the memories of others in this fragmented way. He's never this concrete subject you can simply access, right? And that is maybe part of the novel's form, to refuse classification by never letting us settle into knowledge, right? the surveillance capitalism wants to fix identities, fix knowledge, fix space. And the novel is constantly moving, rupturing, so we can never do that. Right? So I would say that. Thank you for the question.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's an interesting kind of commentary on realism as a literary form, right? And the resistance to realism as being complicit in these forms of surveillance or classification. That's a really expansive argument.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering and thinking what is going on now, for example, with Muslims in South Asia and the state with its trying to create some kind of difference based on the Hindu state, and right. Whether you see parallels there, or a similar kind of process, or is there something different going on?
Yeah, I'm not at all a scholar of India, but I would absolutely agree that the BJP and the far right use technology and manage media and kind of totally produce hate and mobilize the Hindu right through constant kind of news and information about Muslims, right? Muslim women marrying Hindu men, Muslims eating beef, I mean, you name it, right? When COVID started, if you remember the rumor that that mosque in Delhi was a super spreader site and that COVID was a Muslim disease. I mean, if you remember that awful ways in which, right, the technology and surveillance capitalism is kind of used, right? And people get hooked on to these, we're so hooked on to the phone technology, and we kind of keep, and that information, if you're interested in that, and that's kind of what Zuboff says, and kind of, if you're interested in certain kinds of things, and the information you get gets clustered, right? So you're inundated with clusters, and then out of that kind of surveillance capitalists, kind of Google or whatever, produce these kind of algorithms that tell patterns and tell you who's doing what and what's profitable, right? So I think absolutely similar things are happening globally, right? So India is no exception. That's what I would add.
I don't want to dominate the floor, but just wondering though, with the idea of surveillance capitalism in this process, and then if we, certainly there are kind of global processes going on, and the sort of even from the kind of turn to neoliberalism that and privatization, and that are, I think, associated with what you're talking about when you use the term surveillance capitalism. But I'm wondering where that you implied as you were talking that there's almost a profit motive even in, say, surveillance, and we can see it linked up with on apps and Twitter and those kinds of things. But it also seems to me that as with racism in the United States, there's a kind of sort of non-profitable element to it. In other words, pushed to its extremes, perhaps. There, or maybe we could talk about it as a contradiction of this system. When you push, you get to the point of even look what's happening in Ukraine, where we have mass destruction, not only sort of creating a kind of ethnicized distinctions, but sort of blowing things up in the process. And I'm just wondering if you see any or have thought about that, about this issue of surveillance capitalism in these terms at all, or is this just my reading of the news?
And Ukraine,
you don't have to talk about Ukraine, but just think about the
if we stick, I don't know, if we stick to the novel, and the Isa's
Yeah.
kind of observations on first the invasion of Afghanistan, and then the invasion of kind of Iraq at the end of the novel, and warfare, right? I'm not sure that that's the contradiction of, surveillance capitalism. Blowing things up is highly profitable for some people, right? So I'm not sure what you think the contradiction is. It's arms sales, it's guns, it's military, it's the expansion of what arms dealers and traders and the military industrial complex feeds off of, right? So it's harmful in the sense it's extremely harmful to human populations and countries, but it's not a contradiction in terms of profit making. I don't know if you disagree with me.
Well, I would just be skeptical in the sense that yeah, it's profit making for some people, but it's obviously not for most people, for the people you've talked about, but even in the upper echelons, and there's things get pushed to extremes. We have to think about, what is going on beyond profit in this process. Where, or what are these profits being used for, to buy a bigger yacht? In other words, can we think about it? I would think we need to think about it as almost like a system of meaning that gives people, rather than a system of profit per se. I guess is maybe how I would put it. That there's something going on that it gets talked about, or people think that they're doing it to earn more money, but why are they earning more money? I guess this. And then I'm wondering that in the novel whether any sort of questions like that come up at all.
Yeah, I don't know, a system of meaning that's kind of underlying you're saying these activities, right?
Well, yeah, I'm speaking as a cultural anthropologist, where that is, and I'm the idea that yeah. So it's just a thought.
I'm gonna think about it. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thoughts.
Hi, I had a quick question. So this is great, and this is all of this is very fresh to me, new to me. So I have kind of just Kathy kind of said before, we have sort of the naive questions kind of coming in as sort of outsiders and disciplinary outsiders in a sense. If you care to, feel free to punt. But you mentioned that the third section of your talk was we are all Arabs now. And you had kind of mentioned as an off-the-cuff comment that this was exploratory and that this was something new that you were kind of working through yourself and figuring out, what do I think about all this? And you even narrated it in a way of saying, I initially thought this, but then I later came to thought that. If you're interested, I would just be kind of curious to hear you describe your process. And to hear more about what you see as the stakes in this, and how you have gone about working through this material.
Well, I would say that section I present is, the question of, political identities versus kind of identities we claim. Like, so in the US, right, the label of Black is really only for, say, African Americans, I would say, or maybe Afro-Caribbeans. It's very specific, right? Like, if I were to ever use that term, I would be shouted out of the room, right? I mean, that's clear, and I respect that, and that's totally true. But I think what was fascinating to me about the novel, and also, I'm interested in this other Sri Lankan writer, Ambalavana Sivanandan, who was an activist in London. And what's really interesting about the Black consciousness movement and his own writing in London is that in both these spaces, in England and in South Africa, claims to blackness or political blackness were used by people who may otherwise not, today we may not never consider Black, right? And I don't think today in London, South Asians think of themselves as Black. But there was a historical period when under the sign of Blackness, there was a way of trying to collectivize difference, right? And today I think it's seen as unfashionable and denying difference, right? Oh my God, you can't subsume multiple identities under Blackness, that's absurd. I mean, I think you would hear that today, but I just wanted to rethink that history a little bit more carefully and think about, like, was there a political work that did, which was to automatically say Blackness is not biological and whiteness is not biological, right? These are created. These are things that are made, right? These are not natural. And so the kind of denaturalization of race through the use of the political label Blackness was really interesting to me. And I really want to pursue that line of thinking more. But then when the novel says we're all Afghan Arabs now, and gives that term also to this white woman, right? To this Africana woman, I was like, oh, like, that seems really a stretch, right? So I'm really trying to think about what are possible identities, like, how do we think collectivity? What are the ways? I mean, you can think about, for example, when we protested last year under the sign of Black Lives Matter, I don't think it was that we were saying we're all Black, right? Like, it was a multiracial protest, but it was through this understanding that Blackness was an important site of struggle for all of us, and that supporting and protesting the murder of African Americans is essential to all of us, right? So I think, like, that's where I'm trying to get at with, like, political Blackness or political Arabness. What are the ways in which a sign can be used, not as like, that's who I am, but as this is how we can forge collectivity. And I think Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement really did that, and tried to do that in the 1970s, right? Create this collective out of the multiplicity, because the apartheid state is so invested in segregation, separation, right? The Bantustans, like the homelands, it's separate people up, cut them up, set them up against each other. So how do you overcome that? And that was kind of their experiment. I'm asking, are there similar modes of collective identity, political identity that we can come to now? So I guess I hope I answered your question a little bit. I'm not sure if I did, but that's where I'm kind of thinking. So thank you. Thanks.
So are there other questions? I guess one thought in thinking of the Black consciousness
Movement
issue is I think one of the sort of trends in African thought was the concern of, or I suppose we could almost think of it even in Fanon's terms, but I think later thinkers were thinking about the constraints of claiming a specific identity. The kind of inversion of image or terms of stigmatization and turning it into its inverse. But it sounds from your description of the novel that he's really pushing towards something that goes beyond the constraints of an inversion of signs. And I just wondered if that's something that you thought about.
Right, and there's this moment in the novel, Shukri kind of says, he expounds like the fallacies of race, right? So at one level, he really wants us to understand that race is and emerges through kind of capitalist expansion, right? There is that clear understanding of race is not natural or biological. It's not about your skin color. It's not about your body, right? So there's that. But I think in that scene where he talks about his two mothers and the love and the care they showered on one another, the way they protected one another, right? Vasinth protects Gloria, the way Gloria delivers Vasinth. I mean, she would have hemorrhaged and like died on the floor there if Gloria hadn't turned up and delivered her baby and been, you know, because I mean, there's a scene in the novel which talks about ambulances for non-whites don't take 2 hours to come. So even if she had managed to somehow phone a hospital, she would have died on that kitchen floor, right? So the affection and the love that the two women show for one another and their children, I think is what transforms kind of the notion of a political blackness to this really powerful sign, right? And it's throughout the novel, it's Gloria who raises the children, especially Isa, into thinking critically about race, but also like refusing like apartheid, right? And there's this beautiful scene, which I had to skip because, you know, the paper was too long, where they go, the children, the family is going on this road trip, they stop at a roadside stop, and the kids, Kagiso and Isa, go to buy some like ice lollies or something. They come back because, you know, they don't know what apartheid is, and the woman, the store owner says, you came to the whites only entrance, go to your designated entrance, right? And so the kids come back saying, we don't know what's going on, she didn't give us the lollies. And so Gloria, you know, takes the children back. She goes back to the rest stop, right? And she uses the non-white entrance and she says, well, I want some lollies, but I also want a bicycle. I'll buy that too, right? And then the woman says, oh, well, I can't give it to you through these little grills for non-white people. Come over. Let's use the whites only entrance, right? So then Gloria says, well, I'm not gonna come over. You either, you know, dismantle the bicycle, right? And the woman says, I can't do that. Then Gloria says, well, dismantle your bars if you can't dismantle the bicycle and pass the pieces through. So there are these numerous moments where like Gloria highlights the absurdity of segregation, but all the while protecting her two children and showing them, right? Like the ways, the systems of classification are grounded in profit, are grounded in, you know, these other forces. And in that moment, you know, that scene which I love so much, and it's so hard to kind of unpack that scene. The store owner says, looks at Isa and Kagiso and says, are these both your children? Because one looks like your child, but the other is Indian. And she says, yeah, they're both my children, right? And kind of embraces him into her kind of formation as mother. So I think it is like this, that's what's so beautiful about the novel. It is the space of domesticity and love and mothering that really teaches them about being politically Black. And it's really a departure from the kind of masculinity of the Black consciousness movement, right? In some ways. It really pays attention to the critiques that have emerged since the movement, right? Similar to maybe the way feminist critiques have emerged about the Black Panthers, right? So there's a real kind of re-scripting of political Blackness through love, I guess, and kind of a different kind of formation. I don't know if that answers your question. So yeah, that's a great question, thank you.
No, I don't know about that. I feel like it's the middle of the night.
It's 3 something in the morning for me. So
I know, I can't believe you have anything to say at this point. So, but would anybody else like to raise any issues? I know a couple of you came in towards the end, but Tavi, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I had another question about the novel, and something that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, Nimanthi, was how the novel that you're studying is autobiographical. And obviously the author that comes to mind for me is you know, it's Coetzee. And I was just wondering, how important is it to you and your study that these are based in the social reality of our world? So would an author who's culturally or ethnically or nationally differently situated, would their work signify differently because of that kind of the excess of the biography, right? I mean, we all know that Coetzee is a very controversial author, right? So I'm just wondering, like, what is the role of the author's actual politics or actual standpoints?
Yeah, so it's, I gestured to this at the beginning, but the way Isa in the novel is questioned at Heathrow, I don't know if you know this, but a decade later, literally Ishtiyaq Shukri is stopped at Heathrow, questioned, and actually refused entry, right? And he writes about this evocative very powerfully in Africa is a Country, where his wife is English. He says, my wife is English. I've been a permanent resident of England for 10 years. But I think he had flown to, I think it was Yemen, or where his wife is like the Oxfam head. And because he flew from there back to London, he's refused entry. And it took him years of like petitioning the Home Office to get back in, right? I mean, in a sense, Isa predicts what's going to happen to Shukri, because this happens to Shukri much later. But I think the biographical is important for Shukri, but I want to say that is not the central point of maybe the novel, right? What's really amazing about both his texts, and I see it's even harder for me to grasp than the Silent Minaret, like I'm still working through that one, is a complete mix of sometimes biographical detail, fictional accounts, historical details, right? Excerpts from, like I said, the Quran or the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a whole chapter of his dissertation in there with footnotes, right? So I think what's important is that he doesn't want you to think of identities as the stable, fixed things, and that the author, the kind of author producing knowledge in singular way. He's really invested in thinking about the very process of knowledge production, the very process of how identities are made. And he makes that explicit by kind of putting together these things that don't go together, right? So you're suddenly like, whoa, where am I? Like historically and temporally, but also like, what am I reading now? Oh, this is an excerpt from a document. Oh, now I'm back to, and who's speaking shifts too. So I think he really he's not invested in that kind of biographical detail, even though ironically, Isa and his life kind of echo each other, but he's an extremely political writer. He's very, very concerned about Islamophobia, right? He's not like blind to any of that stuff, and that's what motivates him. But that's what I feel when I read this book. I mean, others may have different readings, yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was coming back from upstate New York, and I was in the train, so I didn't want to be out. I was just listening to you, and so out of guilt of like, of course, missing it, I also went and like read what other stuff that you've sort of written and got a sense, so that I'm not completely clueless when I ask this. Also, the thing I like about literature and novels is some things should only be written as literature. They should not be tarnished in academia, quote unquote. I think there's something about the genre of literature that also complicates it and allows it to go free in that complication. So I think it's a statement when we say that we all have become, or we all are now Arabs. Now, instinctively, it feels, yes, this makes so much sense. Now, but that's not where I stay. I also move and be like, but I'm also not Arab. Now, that's complete now. And I also say that that's also because I've been looking at the attack on Palestinians in particularly in the mosque just now. And I'm thinking about how we share so much. I'm Muslim, they are Muslim, but I'm not Arab, and they're not. And even within the spectrum of being Arab. They are Palestinians and they are non-Palestinians. And I see, and I don't think, I see there's a great amount of necessary merit in seeing identities as flexible, shifting, because really that's how they are. A, we don't know what they really mean. B, they shift, so it also becomes like difficult to know. But having said that, there's also political tangibleness to violence, where somebody like to violence and to vulnerability. So we all protest Black Lives Matters, and when when the police attacks the entire protest, it just attacks protesters. But the vulnerability of the Black body, vulnerability of the disabled body, vulnerability of the woman body, vulnerability of the visible queer body is a lot more than let's see other bodies. Now that's I'm not trying to do what I call oppression Olympics. I'm not trying to say whose hurt is more or less, but I'm also trying to understand, because how do we make sense of this? And I really feel literature has an answer, or has some possibility of an answer. So if you can share some possibilities that come to mind.
That's a great question. And I think that is why the use of political blackness, right, which is where I begin this kind of turn with Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement, is, you know, has been criticized, right? And I think I have two things I would say. One is that, like I said, I look to Sivanandan's work, where he was this Sri Lankan Tamil writer who lived in London after 1956. And, you know, when he uses the term Black in his own writing and his own activism, I don't think he ever claims to be a Black person. And he has this great quote. He says, "Black is the color of my politics, not the color of my skin," right? And there's something about when I organize, there's a sign under which I will organize, right? And that does not ever mean he forgets his Tamil, his, you know, Sri Lanka and the history of oppression in Sri Lanka against Tamils. He'll never forget that, right? Or claim a different identity. But once you have to organize and mobilize against a racist state, like what are the formations you need to do that? I think that gap is there for him. And I would say maybe it is, I think it's less so. Black consciousness movement is more complicated than that, but I turn to Sivanandan often. But the other thing I will say is that in Shukri's novel, when the novel uses the term "we're all Afghan Arabs now," or "we're all Arabs now," so I think you miss this, but like it talks about figures who want to claim that term giving up certain privileges, right? Not saying, oh, if I go to a protest and say this, then I'm, right? It is, so in the novel, there's this woman who kind of settles in Palestine. Like she's an Afrikaner woman. She meets this Palestinian man and she kind of moves to Palestine, right? At the end of the novel. So there is a sense that those claims can't be made willy-nilly. They have to be made through like this self-critique, but also giving up some of the things that separate you to whiteness and privilege, right? And so the Black consciousness movement at the beginning especially was really against this term called non-racialism, right? And non-racialism was this term used at the time to say that Black and white students in the universities could both work together. And BCM said, you know, no, because the white students always come and they say a lot of things, but they're never going to give up their privilege or the privileges they have through apartheid, the very structure, right? And so what gets prioritized is always them, and who's vulnerable is always us, right? So in the beginning, the Black consciousness movement did not have any white people. They wanted a separate space, right? To think Blackness, right? Without this kind of, so that's what I would say, that it's not an open like claim. It comes with like careful choices you have to make and things you have to give up, privileges you have to refuse, right? If not, it's totally tokenist. I don't know if I get you anywhere. I'm still thinking this through, but that was a really great question.
No, actually, it actually makes sense, because we keep talking about, me and some of my friends who work on resistance we start to think about this whole thing that's come about passing the mic.
Mhm.
And I've really been thinking about giving, like, how do we make sense of giving up, and using the same metaphor, I would say, but you need to leave the stage.
Right.
I don't think it's about passing the mic. It's about first questioning, how did I have the mic first to begin with?
Mhm.
And second, just leave the stage. And that'll actually probably require people actively saying no,
Yeah.
and giving up opportunity, and incurring losses,
Right.
because I think that's important. And that sort of will push against the status quo of everybody is equal. I mean, that's not how it works. But anyways, thank you so much.
No. And when the Black consciousness movement first separated from the National Students Union, it was really criticized in South Africa for being kind of reverse racist. All of that discourse was used, but their position is we have to have a space to think and theorize our own sense of identity and politics, right? So that was and then later that shifted, but that was definitely important for the initial. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay. I'm afraid our time is more than up. So, I want to thank you for this really stimulating talk, and for people's great questions and comments. And
yeah. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Kathy. Thanks.